Welcome to the Start Here podcast for web development. I'm Keith Monahan.
And I'm Dane Miller.
And we're here to show you how to build a career in web dev. You can find us online at starthere.fm.
Hey Keith, how's it going?
Good. So you going to buy a gold Apple Watch now? $10,000?
Yeah, well, of course, right?
Just
$10,000 Apple Watch.
Pocket change, I guess, or wrist change.
What about you, though? Did you see the keynote? Did you like what you saw?
You know, I didn't watch the keynote. I know, it's terrible.
Well, you're not an Apple fan, so you don't have to. I have to, because I'm an Apple fan. So
it's a requirement for being an Apple fan.
Yeah, it is. They actually come and take our MacBooks in black vans if you don't watch it.
You haven't watched your quota of Apple stuff today.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Dude, maybe one day.
Right. Okay, so here's the real question. Do you have a skinny wrist or a big wrist?
Skinny, dude.
Okay.
Totally.
So you have to get the little 38 millimeter one. It's like so tiny.
What? They have a small version?
Yeah, they have two versions, a big one and a small one. And I wanted the big one, and I was like, why would you get a small one? I don't understand. And then somebody explained to me, well, it's going to look like a pizza box on your wrist if you have a small wrist.
Yeah, or like some obtrusive piece of electronics.
Yeah.
Huh.
And we're programmers, so we have ladylike wrists.
That is so funny.
We don't pull rope all day.
No, there's this company, I want to say it was BuzzFeed or maybe it was BuzzFeed, did this video about skinny guys. Have you seen that?
No.
It is hilarious. It is like a whole video about skinny guy problems.
Oh, really?
I'll post it on here so people can see it.
Yeah.
In the show notes. It's hilarious. So the Apple, the watch is intriguing. I listened to a podcast, the Niche podcast with Jonathan Stark, and he is totally a proponent of the watches. And his thoughts were that they actually save him time because it's easier to glance at a notification on your watch, and then if you don't need to respond, you can just dismiss it, right? Or if you do need to respond, you can pull out your phone. But when you get a notification on your phone without the watch, like, you have to pull it out of your pocket every single time. And what he was saying is that it's super easy to get distracted once your phone is out of your pocket and it's in your hand. And it's an interesting idea. I'd never thought about it as actually as a way to essentially increase your productivity.
Yeah, it's like you're hedging against distraction, right? So it's like it's the same sort of reason why people buy like Kindle books or Kindle readers, because they don't want to just use the Kindle app on the iPad, because just behind that is like 1,000 games that are super awesome. So it's like the same concept. I like that. I actually hadn't considered that. Like, you get a notification, you just pull up your wrist, maybe you're coding, your wrist is right in your face when you're coding. And it's like, I get a text message or an email alert. It's like, it's so easy to just glance at it. And if you have to take action. I actually think that's cool. I'm probably going to close the email on my desktop then and let the notifications come through my wrist, because the desktop notifications are really intrusive.
Yeah, they are, yeah. Well, I read this article, and I don't remember where I found it, but maybe I can post it, about how Apple has been talking around this experience. So they've been talking about the Apple Watch, I guess the article said, in ways that weren't very cohesive, right? The benefits of the Apple Watch. They weren't tying it all together. And they said that, just what I said, that the reason why it's such a compelling device is that it means you don't have to look at your phone as much. And they said that Apple didn't want to talk about that, because then it means they were like somehow admitting that, there's this whole idea that you can get sucked into your phone and it's a bad thing, right?
Yeah,
they don't want to have any negative connotations with the phone.
There's a really tricky PR situation with the launch of a product like this, especially one that's a companion product. Is you oftentimes, exactly what you said, I think is the problem, is like you don't want to be perceived as downplaying the companion device. You don't want to be perceived as upselling it, right? Like, because if you say the watch is all there is, but actually it's tied to the phone, you have to have a phone to have the watch. Because the apps on the watch are basically like widgets. The phone is what does the network requests, and it sends updates to the watch.
Right, but what's interesting is that the watch actually makes it so you're using your phone less.
But does Apple want that? Like, is Apple's PR going to be like, play up that fact? And that's why I doubt they are. And that's why I've seen very few ads that like emphasize disconnection. You know, you don't see ads like that. You see ads like that emphasize the integrity of it all, the connection of it all. Like, pull out your phone, you can see what you just ran and what you did just a minute ago type thing. Yeah. But I'm on board with you. I think it's a sort of a disconnection device in a way.
Yeah, you know, I went to a UX meetup locally here. We had a discussion about the Internet of Things, and this is kind of, it plays into that discussion that we had, where the Internet of Things is about, it's about sensors, essentially, sensors and other devices that will become more prolific, and they will start feeding us information and data. And then you're going to have these central processing hubs, right? Which could be your phone, or it could be an online service like Google or something like that. And then you'll have these other devices for viewing and consuming that information, right? And so there's like these three different types of I guess devices, right? The sensors that will feed data into the system, and then there'll be the analysis of the data, and then ways to consume the information. And it's interesting. We went off on a tangent about how it would be great to see that computing paradigm step away from the phone and to online, because then your device is just a screen. It's ubiquitous, and you don't have to necessarily take it with you, or if you lose it, you can replace it, and it's literally zero downtime.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about that exact topic of like devices that are shells for some kind of web server component somewhere that like maybe, you know, so basically I see all these like startups coming out. Like there's that startup that just launched that is basically selling you a little square, and you take it home and you plug it into an internet connection, and then you automatically get the latest operating system because it's all coming from the server. And then you sort of combine that idea with like maybe those like balloons Google's launching in with Google Lunar. And then, you know, combine that with some other stuff that's happening, and the trend could really easily go towards this like always on server side computing paradigm where the device doesn't have an operating system. The device is just like a shell for something else, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so the other thing that I've been thinking about in this realm, that part of the whole disconnect from the device thing, specifically from the phone, is like right now, we have preferences. You have preferences, I have preferences. And what's really frustrating to me is that when I go into a piece of software like Google or like Facebook, and I have to duplicate the same preferences in both places. And where those converge is perhaps on my phone, where I can set some global preferences, right? And what I would like to see is a service, or maybe nonprofit, maybe government, I don't know, preferably not government, that was a place where we could define all of those services, and maybe even have data about us, right? Some basic preference data. And that would live somewhere besides the phone. Because, I don't know, it's compelling. I would like to be able to, instead of Facebook owning all my preferences, what I'd like to be able to do is if I connect, because they make money off of me, off of my preferences. And they can use that, and that's privacy. And it's this dichotomy of services or privacy. Which one do you want? Do you want to use this Facebook service that everyone else uses? Or do you want to have privacy? And it puts you in this really difficult situation. And I think that a new model could be this central preferences hub of some sort, where
or decentral preferences hub.
Yes, thank you. Well, okay, yes, it's a decentralized preferences hub. It's decentral from everybody else, but it's just one portal essentially. And what you do is, instead of, I mean, there's been lots of discussion about this trend towards paying for services instead of having to give up your privacy.
Totally.
Right? And so when you connect to a service, the service literally sends an auth request or something to your hub, and it says, hey, I mean, and the apps on our phones do this right now. And it literally says, hey, can I have authorization to look at this information or to have some of this information from you, right? And then you can say yes or no. And at any time, you can log into your hub and you can see what apps have authorizations, and then you can revoke them if you want to. And so it puts the user right at the center of their own privacy online. And it hasn't grown that way because of, well, advertising, right? So.
Well, when you say preferences, what also I hear is just data. So you're kind of saying data in a way. And what one thing that I'm seeing in this area is things like Ethereum, which is sort of like a decentralized organization with a platform and programming language and application building structure that allows for building decentralized applications that can communicate with each other in a unified way, but the data never is owned by a single company. Like the decisions aren't made by a single company. Nothing is made by anybody. It's all made by the individual pieces, right? And so if you think that might be one thing that happens in the future, then perhaps that will solve that, right? Like, because, the one reason why everybody's so sketch about the Internet of Things, and the reason it's like not already here, is like, privacy and security and like all these issues of like, well, if I connect everything, then somebody's going to own everything. And it's like, well, not really, because in the future, everything could one version of the future, one multiverse that could potentially happen is that the Bitcoin blockchain is what runs everything. Like the mathematical paradigm of that blockchain is what Ethereum sits on and what all of these decentralized apps run on. And it's just it's a math algorithm, right? So it's like that theoretically should be what's running things. I mean, not some corporation full of humans that have emotion and mental, like if like we're in a mathematical world, like why not let math run things?
Well, and their intentions are not for our benefit, typically, right? I mean, if the primary,
because they're not run by math.
If their primary intention is to make money.
Right. Yeah,
and the way they do that is through advertising. Then they will always be at odds with the user in some way, like Facebook is. I mean, sure, they can create a compelling user experience, and the ubiquitousness of it, ubiquity. Thank you, of that. Is that everybody has it, so that's another selling factor. But the trade-off is that you are giving your private information to Facebook in exchange for that, and it's sad.
You mentioned ubiquity though, and people might say what I just was referencing is super fringe, like this Ethereum thing. Well, I will tell you, they're working with the W3C payment group. Like Ethereum, the foundation, there is one piece of the company that's a foundation, and that foundation's job is to go around and do business development, basically, with other big entities that will allow those big entities to consider moving to a decentralized model.
Oh, interesting.
And they've been invited to the W3C sort of payment group, where that's the first place they're going to try to introduce some of this decentralization so that nobody can hack the money system in the future. That's what they would like to build. So it's funny because if you think, what is the first thing that somebody should build a decentralized model around? It's like, well, you should probably do it around the most complicated thing, but that sucks. It's a pain in the ass, but it's true. Like, you should fix money, and you should fix people hacking money. So tough problem.
Yeah. Well, on data, it'd be super easy to have your decentralized hub, and then the hub itself wouldn't store your data. You could just connect it to your favorite data storage, connect it to Dropbox, and then you literally, your data.
There's actually a really popular Dropbox clone in Ethereum on the store there's like a decentralized version of Dropbox. It's like Decentral Box or some shit like that. But
but the idea is that when you connect your hub to other services, any data you create there is actually your data, and it gets saved into your personal database, wherever you want that to be, whether that's in Google Drive or on Amazon somewhere in a personal cloud or Dropbox or whatever. And so it's compelling. I'm going to have to take a look at Ethereum. That sounds really interesting.
Well, the funny thing is, like, your data, what you just said though is sort of only half true, right? Like, your data could technically never exist in Amazon EC2 or on your own server. The whole point of a decentralized model is that 1,000 pieces of your data exist in like 1 million different locations, right? So nobody could ever know where your data is. And
but
if
could I retrieve it? I mean, could I retrieve it and delete it?
It's like a torrent, right? Like you torrent things in the same way.
But could I delete it?
Yeah, deletion works in the same way. It just has to go through and first collect up all those pieces. And the whole point of this, like a mathematical model, is it's like a linked list. Like you don't actually know what the next item is until you get to the next item, and then that item points to the next item, and you know, it's very simple, but
Bitcoin,
somehow
it's pretty
so
cool.
secure, which is really funny.
Yeah. Well, I hope it takes off. I read a very discouraging article about Bitcoin when it first came out, so I kind of avoided it, unfortunately, because the price of Bitcoin just skyrocketed after that.
I think Bitcoin could potentially fail big time, but I mean, I think what won't fail is what this paper was written on, which is the blockchain. Like that concept of how that's actually implemented and used at scale to do all these transactions, that's pretty world class. Like that, you know, they're invited to the W3C to talk about the blockchain. They aren't talking about Bitcoin, which that's interesting.
So I guess to get going, first off, we just wanted to highlight a few people that interacted today. Since last episode. They had some good questions. Last week we talked about wireframing and user experience in general, user experience design, like UX design. So Matthew Geiger on Twitter, he asked a question: do wireframes include fly-in boxes or pop-ups? And I think the idea is there: do you articulate your interactions in your wireframe? And I think, yeah, if it's an important enough interaction, that's part of the experience, for sure. You could, I mean, obviously it's static, so you can make notes. So you could create a duplicate wireframe and show it in its other transformed state or something like that. So yeah, for sure, I would definitely do stuff like that, like design your pop-up modals and things like that. Yeah, and then Mark Ward has some questions. He asked, wouldn't the UI be determined by the device type? So the user interface be determined by the device type, and when should we consider that? And yeah, that's a great question, and for sure it should. You can go down a rabbit hole here because there are thousands of different types and sizes of devices, right? And so if you're thinking about desktop and mobile and maybe tablet as well, yeah, I guess it depends on how much time you want to spend fine-tuning the experience on every single device. Typically, we work with responsive design, and so the design on a desktop typically works fairly well on a tablet, and then probably has to be modified more for a mobile phone. And so, if you need to think through what that design is going to look like, how it's going to transform to the mobile phone, then yeah, definitely you can wireframe for the mobile, and then move to wireframing for desktop, or vice versa. I guess whatever you feel most comfortable with. There's this idea that we should design mobile first, and that's a literal statement. So you would literally start wireframing with the mobile device first. And the idea is that since you have such a small screen and it's more difficult to work with, that you only put in the important stuff. When you move that site to a desktop, it's a better experience because you didn't just throw everything in that you could. You really thought through what should be there.
Yep.
So great question, yeah.
So Keith, last week we spoke about wireframing and all of the things that are involved, some of the things you think about and the problems that you face. And we also discussed how wireframing is using a thick marker, or can be often visualized by using a thick marker to draw. How does one take those wireframes and move on to the next step, which is, from my perspective, the next step is getting the HTML on the page, getting the CSS on the page, beginning the actual website. How do you make that transition?
Yeah, great question. So for sure, it's about prototyping. Yeah, prototyping in the browser, and I will prototype with HTML and CSS, and literally just bring over the wireframe designs to the browser, so you can kind of play with things. You can actually click buttons. You can click between pages if you've done pages. But when do you know when to switch from wireframing to prototyping? I think that's a tough question, because you can't really say, oh, you should wireframe XYZ and then you can start prototyping. It's probably more of a gut feel.
What if the answer was this? Would you agree with it? You switch from wireframing to prototyping when you're sufficiently excited to begin prototyping.
Yeah, sure. I think so. I mean,
seems good.
Yeah, because
that means like you've got it all thought out. Like you've probably done enough thinking. You're kind of excited about your thinking. You probably have some kind of organizational concept to how you want to go about it, because that can lead to excitement as well.
Right. So you've done enough wireframing that you have a really solid idea for what you want to see. And so this last week I've started prototyping and started building in the browser, and it's fun because we can see it. I mean, it's very bland because I'm still using grays, right? So it's I do prototyping in a similar way to wireframing in that it's not very pretty, but what it is, it's getting the elements on the page in the right spot, in the right size, and then seeing how they interact together, and then working on the responsive part of it. That's the prototyping phase is where I'm going to fine tune the responsive nature down into mobile. Like, how does it look? How does it feel? So with the prototyping, I started doing that this last week, and I started working on one particular section because I had wireframed that, and I wanted to see how those different elements in the wireframe, and actually you guys will have seen them, or you can see them on the show page for last week, and I wanted to see how those would work before I went any further. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to do more wireframing for other sections of the site before I continue with the prototyping in the browser, because and maybe it'll be really informal. Maybe I won't use Balsamiq, like the digital wireframing. Maybe I'll just use pen and paper and just sketch it out if I already have an idea.
And this is where we're moving away from waterfall a bit, right? So the waterfall model would be to finish all your wireframing and then it's very static, like cut or dry, like finish all your wireframing, then move on to the prototyping.
And you mean wireframe every single page?
Yeah, but I like your model. Your model is a little bit more agile, and I think it's more organic, because what you're doing is you're prototyping one wireframe that you did, and maybe you're going to do some responsive design, but that responsive design and that prototyping can then play into the wireframe. And it's not like the wireframe needs to be a source of truth. There's never like, in my mind, the waterfall model is like there's always a source of truth. It's the wireframes and it's the prototype. For me, it's like there's never a source of truth. There's constantly evolving good ideas.
Sure.
And so that's what you're doing. I love it.
Yeah. And so, I mean, there was even an example in the wireframe for the show page. I had an example where the images of the hosts were, above each other. And when I designed it here, I realized, well, that's not going to work if there's 4 hosts, because it's going to change the width of this column or make the text really narrow. And so I had to rethink it, right? And so,
good point.
Yeah, getting off the wireframing into the prototyping, it just helps you, figure out even further how stuff is going to work.
Yeah. And like viewing all of this as like thinking tools is nice, because it allows you to stop like this perfectionist thinking where you're like, oh, I have to perfect the wireframes, I have to perfect the responsive design. No, it's like all of it is just a tool to think clearly about your project, right?
Yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, that's a good thought. Like, as we go through this process, we just talked about this whole development process is basically going from obscurity into clarity.
Yeah.
Right? It's like your job is to take this idea, and then as you dig in, as you get into the weeds for these different tasks, whether it's back-end development, front-end development, UX design, or whatever it is, as you go from, as you dig in, you start to there's a path that becomes apparent, and it's never, or is very rarely straight, from point A to point B. It's always this back and forth wavy path, maybe in circles, right? If you're that leads you to the end.
Right. And I think the concept of waterfall has been to try to make that path as straight as possible. People think if I can go from one to the next, to the next, to the next, it's a straight path. And if I do agile, it might be a wavy kind of back and forth path, and it's like kind of confusing. I disagree. I actually don't think it's confusing. I think it's more natural and more organic.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, yeah, you do too.
Cool. Yeah, it definitely feels more organic to, I mean, I guess it probably takes a little bit of experience to feel that way, I think, because early on, you
don't even know. Yeah, you don't know.
Right. Early on, I would have a project and I would prototype like I probably have a couple hundred wireframes for a mobile app. It was a maintenance app, right, for an industry. Like, and I had literally drawn out like probably 100 or 200 pages, like screens of this thing, and it still hadn't designed it in the browser, right? Yeah. That was early on, and so thinking back, I'd be like, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? I would totally just get a general feel for it and then just test it out now.
Yeah.
It's a progression, like I said, from obscurity into clarity. From wireframing is very rough, and then prototyping is less rough, and then from prototyping you're going to go into actually designing. And one of the steps between prototyping and designing is starting to think about the feel of the experience, and so you can start thinking about buttons. Like I spent I don't know how much time with some button design for the prototype, just because it was one of those little things, right? It was an interaction that I wanted to be like buttery smooth and like really cool.
But if you don't mind, let's talk about how you did that button thing. Like, not the actual implementation, but what you did was you kind of dove in and you sort of went way deep on it, and you were playing around with all these different border styles and different border paddings and all this stuff. You went all the way to the bottom. You know, you really dove in, but you came back for air. And so what what I want to juxtapose that with is you doing 200 pages of designs for a mock-up. Like, that's not coming out. That's going all in and staying there.
That's a good example.
Like, so if somebody came to me with 200 pages that were drawn for an app, and they were like, I'm having problems with this idea, the business and the execution, I'd be like, well, you know, you spent too long, you went too deep, you didn't come back. Well, you got to come back. And I think somehow elaborating that is important.
That's a great example. And somewhere I thought of Inception for some reason, right?
Sure.
Where you go so deep you can't come back or something.
Totally. And that's a totally legit thing. Like, if you guys, listeners, if you're all spending your time on wireframes and you spend an inordinate amount of time on wireframes, stop, because you're going to have even harder of a time stopping if you keep going. It just gets worse and worse because it's a perfection thing, maybe.
Yeah. Well, it definitely can be. I think it is, because you can only take a wireframe so far, and then you have to put it in the browser to continue working on it, you know, because even you spend time trying to understand the best way to, lay out a website with a wireframe, but then you put it in the browser and then it doesn't exactly work like you thought it would.
Totally.
Yeah, so moving to prototyping, super cool, super fun, allows you to work out the interactions, and this is actually when you can start playing with some of that. You could implement a little bit of JavaScript for some interaction if you wanted to. I'd keep it pretty bare bones though. One thing I wanted to mention real quick about the wireframing, not to get into the weeds, like if you have 5 complete like wireframe pages or views, then that's probably a good time to start.
Totally.
To start going. I had 3 versions of my wireframe. I posted all of them. You can look at them if you want. There's a first, second, and then the third one that I'm putting into the prototype now. And that's one view, right? I only worked on one view, articulating that. And then I jumped here. I'm going to go back and work on others. But I would say that if you had like 5, I wouldn't do any more than 5, preferably less.
That's cool that you gave a number. Like, it allows us to tell the listeners to stop. So do not go further than 5.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So I guess the next logical question for me is, when do you know that you're done prototyping and you're actually accidentally implementing? Like, when do you... There's like this... For me, when I start doing front-end shit, I can never find the line... Well, I'm going to actually just implement a design somewhat that's coming to me on the fly, versus I'm going to restrict myself here and not do that, and instead just do some prototyping, like some gray boxes and how do you like do
how
that?
Do you stop from going too deep into the prototyping? That, I think it takes experience as well, because oh my gosh, I love to tinker.
Sure.
And I love CSS. It's cool. I like it, and I will tinker forever.
Yeah.
If I let myself. But I think it just comes with experience, probably. You know, with the prototyping I did here, I just gave myself gray, essentially. Black, white, and gray. And I'm using different shades of gray to articulate different tones, whether it's dark or light, on the page. And then I'll be able to go in and add the color later. I don't think you should be using color on a prototype. Again, because that's one more thing. And to get to your other question, how do you go from prototyping to actually designing? Like, what is the life of a prototype? Where does it go after it's lived its usefulness? Well, I'm building this prototype to be the design. So I'm structuring the CSS and the HTML in a way that makes sense and in a way that is relatively production ready. And so as a prototype, it's fleshing out the actual design, and then what I'll do is I'll come back in later and I'll start adding more interactions, and then I'll start adding more color and the actual design elements of the page. And again, maybe it's more of a feeling like when you start, but in this sense, I think that a prototype, it needs to. Obviously, before you move on to the design stage, your prototype has to pretty much be a full app. Or a full site. Wouldn't you say it needs to articulate every view?
I think I'm a weird case because I don't think I've ever had an idea that I built every single view for. I would always just get excited about an idea, build a few views, and then not finish it.
But we're doing it differently because we're like working on this project together, right? So there's a clear delineation between our roles. You're working on the back end and I'm working on the front end, and so if we're talking about like a work project, then I agree with you. Like I think theoretically you would have a prototype for every single page. In order to become the actual HTML for the site, you have to have the HTML and CSS for the podcast show page, and then for a single podcast, and for a hosts page, and all of these different, and even the admin view. Well, I think that's less important to get going to start with, right? But the admin view of how are you going to edit this application? What is that going to look like?
And oftentimes I think the word prototyping is even weird because it makes people think that we're going to throw this out or something. But I obviously, me and you approach this the same way. This is just like the first draft of a page that will exist. Like this exact page will exist. Mm-hmm. It might even have this exact HTML. It's just the colors are going to be different, and maybe it's going to change a lot, but maybe it doesn't, right? Like, so you're building like the structure of the house. Mm-hmm. It's not quite like a prototype kind of lends itself to, I feel like people think, throw it away after, right? Like we don't throw away prototypes.
Right. It definitely feels like there is that connotation with the prototype. Yeah. The idea is that it's just super loosely coupled, right? You don't want to start creating these really intense design patterns or anything, because it needs to be fluid still. It's still in that kind of that wireframe stage where things can move around and things need to, you need to have the freedom to scrap part of it and start over. And so it's got to be really minimalistic.
Sure.
And maybe what I'll do is I'll take this prototype that I have right now, as is, and I'll post it somewhere where we're not going to update it at all, so you guys can see what this looks like from here.
Yeah. Okay. So next topic. So you chose to not use a CSS framework for this. Can you tell us why?
Sure.
Well, first tell us what I mean by that. For listeners that don't understand what a CSS framework is, just lightly define it and then tell us maybe like what one is, like an example of one, and then say why you're not.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so the CSS framework is it's basically a starting place for your style, and it most often if not always, includes a grid, so you can quickly set up your site into grids. Sometimes it's broken down into 12 columns or 10 columns. And then it usually has a outside container width, whether it's 960 or 1200 or whatever. Maybe it's adjustable. But the idea is that it has, it's opinionated. Okay, let's say that. So a CSS framework is opinionated in some ways so that you can plug it into your site and get it up and going very quickly. And so the most common CSS frameworks are Bootstrap and Foundation. And the one I was playing with was UIKit, And there's a ton, actually. There's a ton. Those are the big ones. Yeah, I tend to be a little more of a perfectionist with the CSS. I want the spacing to be exactly like, how I want it. And a lot of times the way that things happen in the responsive, how it responds to width, down to mobile, happens differently than I want it to. And so I guess in that way, I'm a little more opinionated about how I want it to act. So that's...
I can hear the stress in your voice, like from when you think, because I've run into the same issues. When you use a CSS framework, it applies padding to everything in ways that you don't want. And so you have to style something, but you're constantly fighting the framework.
Yes.
And I can totally hear that in your voice.
Yeah. So I started building the prototype with a UI framework. I was actually pretty excited about the UI kit. I think it's getuikit.com. I was pretty excited about that to begin with because they have the best implementation of an off-canvas mobile menu that I've seen between any of the top frameworks, Bootstrap, Foundation, any of them. I loved it. I liked it. I've used it on one other project. But when I got in and I started working with the prototype, I found myself wrangling struggling with the confines of the app itself, and I was like, you know what, I don't want to do this because it is going to be like this for the rest of the time. And whatever benefits I might have experienced, it's going to totally sour the project for me. I'm not going to like it. So ultimately that's why I jumped ship on that. And when I decided that, I got in and I just started fresh. It actually came together way more quickly. But I think, again, that probably comes with experience, knowing how to structure your HTML, knowing how to structure your CSS so that it makes sense, it'll work well. Because you have to think of what it's going to do when it responds down to mobile. What it's going to look like, how it's going to flow. There's probably a bit of experience that goes with that. But I wouldn't say always go use a framework or always start from scratch. I think you should play with both and work with both. I've worked with Foundation, Bootstrap, and a bunch of them. But
yeah, and a great way to learn the best practices in CSS is to just look at Bootstrap and see how they do it, or look at Foundation and see how they do it. You can see the two different types of classes. So they name them. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, they use a ton of divs, right? In order to achieve some of this stuff, right, there's this, they have so much markup. I feel like it clutters.
Ton of markup.
Yeah.
So much.
It's crazy, and that's the other thing, is it is cluttered, and so when you're trying to debug something, it is a pain because you don't know, is it this outer container or this outer container or this outer container, or which one has this padding that's pushing this thing out of whack. Anyway, that's one of the other things.
Well, but like when you're building a framework, you kind of almost have to do that because you're basically building something that people are going to have to. So,
has to be extensible. Yeah.
Well, your customers are writing HTML, but they're not styling stuff. So thinking to yourself in your head, like, how would you implement that? Well, you would have to implement that with a bunch of divs, like HTML nodes, because each one affects the canvas in such ways. And if the customers aren't writing CSS themselves, then we have to do it for them. It's one of those unfortunate things. But I would say, looking at those frameworks, I agree with you. Like, the HTML might not be best practice, but some of the CSS is great. Some of the techniques they use, the grid implementations, are fantastic. Can be very advanced if you're interested in that. So at this point, you guys probably have a good concept for when to jump into prototyping from wireframing. Again, that 5 version per page quote is a good one to stick by. And then you've also given us a good sort of understanding of prototyping and how we have to dive down into some of the details, but then come up for air and make sure that we keep iterating on those wireframes, iterating on the prototypes. But then what would you say is the next step? Because perhaps, a listener is new to web design or web development. And, the next step for me and you might just be very simple in that we're just going to iterate on this prototype over and over again. But do you have any things that jump out at you when you think of the next steps?
Yeah, good question. So working with real data and real content is really important because the content, the content is what should inform your design and your user experience. And so up till now, I've been using lorem ipsum and just some filler text. even though I know in general what the content's going to look like. So I think the next, like after I finish this prototype, and by finish I mean flesh out most of the views, if not all of them, I think the next step would be to connect it up to the app. So the Rails app that you've been building.
Yep.
And then once we get the data to display inside the prototype, we'll be able to see whether or not we need to adjust some things. And so after that, I would go and I would adjust, make adjustments for the actual data, and then, of course, apply the actual styles. Whether we're doing, nice background images or, adding color to different things, fine-tuning the interactions if we're doing some fun JavaScript stuff, whatever. Yeah.
Totally. Cool. Is there anything I'm missing? Any questions that you're thinking would be good for a beginner? Anything else around prototyping that you want to talk about?
Well, this probably makes sense to most people, but you should always prototype locally. And what I mean by that is you may have your own server, right? Like shared hosting server or whatever set up online somewhere on your domain. And it doesn't make sense to like make changes and then push them to the cloud and refresh there. You should definitely be doing it locally.
And if your response to that is that you SSH into the server and then use VI on the server to do editing, and it's the same as if you were editing locally, then this is not for you.
Fair. Okay, if you know what he just said, then this isn't for you. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, okay, so do it locally. What I did for my structure is that I did set up a header. I'm familiar with PHP, so I'm using PHP to have a separate header and footer files, right? So I am, like I said, I'm building this to become the final app, right? So I've got a header and footer file, and I put header stuff and footer stuff, and that means that I can create different pages, and then you reuse those headers and footers. And so, yeah, initially, or even just very basically, you can set up a PHP include or whatever your language you're using to bring in those headers and footers and stuff that are going to need to be duplicated, or even sidebars and stuff like that. So don't be afraid to step into some PHP or something like that. Actually, that's one of the cool things about PHP is that you can set up a server on your computer pretty simply, I think, for PHP, using WAMP server or MAMP or something like that.
WAMP or MAMP.
Yeah. And it is super easy. I mean, PHP was created, we talked about this in one of the previous episodes, PHP was created to be an insanely easy language to work with on the web. And it really is simple to use. Yep. In that regard, if you want to like bring in some files and have it set up like that. Yeah, so last week we asked for examples of your wireframes because we want to see what you guys have come up with, and we shared some of our wireframes online. And so if you still have wireframes that you want to share with us, we'd love to see those. And if you have questions or want some of our thoughts, we'd love to help out with that too. Moving forward, if you have a prototype that you've put together, we'd love to see that, whether it's responsive or not, or super basic. I'm going to throw up our prototype as it is right now somewhere on the website where you can take a look at it. It's going to be, the link for that is going to be on our show page today, which is at starthere.fm/webdev/18. And you can find all of the resources that we talked about there.
And we also want to continue to make this a community project. So feel free to tweet at us at StartHereFM, email us, Dane at StartHereFM, Keith at StartHereFM. And one other thing that we would love to do is if you're also building a project along with us, if you've taken this as an opportunity to sort of learn on the fly, and maybe last week you were doing some wireframes for the first time, maybe this week you're doing prototypes for the first time, that is awesome. And I would love to pair program with you. So if you are about to start something for the first time, or maybe you're an HTML guy, you've done it for a couple of years, maybe you're new, whatever, like just get in touch with us. We would love to continue to build this together.
Well, that's our show for today. Thanks for listening. We will catch you next time.
Bye.
Bye.